Hey guys, this is Pawn Dojo, and we're going to be starting, as of this video, our new series on pretty much the heart and soul of chess, tactics. Now, whenever you're thinking about a game and you're trying to play out the moves, you always got to think one step ahead of your opponent in order to win. If I play this, they play that. If I play this, then they play that. But it can be really mind-numbing to go through that whole thought process on every single move unless you got the right mindset, and you can actually hone that mindset using chess tactics and chess puzzles. Now, what are tactics exactly? Well, tactics are usually a short sequence of moves that will either win you material, or if not even better, just checkmate the king and win the game on the spot with a knockout punch. Now, tactics or puzzles also help build something called pattern recognition, where basically if you see a pattern in the tactic, you'll later see that same tactic or same pattern in a real game, and you'll be like, oh, wait a second, I saw this pattern from this puzzle, and now I can see that in this game, and I can use the same move or same idea. And it sounds a little bit abstract, but as we go through the series, we'll guide you through how to utilize each kind of tactic, and we're categorizing them actually into different kinds of themes, like a lot of other good chess players do. They'll actually categorize tactics. In this video, I'm going to be going over two basic ones, forks and pins. And as we go through the video series, we're going to be highlighting different kinds of categories of chess tactic themes. And at the end, we're also going to be going over how to apply them and also giving you some advice on how to improve your own tactics in your own time. So other than that, I'm just going to jump right in and talk about forks. Now, forks are basically where you have your own piece attacking multiple pieces at the same time. And you can think about it in an abstract sense like a kitchen utensil, like the actual fork, where you have multiple prongs. Basically, the point is, as you'll see in this example, for example here, the knight can give a check. But at the same time, the knight can attack the queen. It's got that bizarre L shape, right? So if it's attacking both of these pieces at the same time, you can notice how it kind of looks like a fork, a little bit abstract, but yeah, it's got those two prongs attacking two pieces at the same time. And basically, you're giving black an uncomfortable choice, because either they have to move their king and lose their queen, which is terrible, right? Or they move their queen and lose their king, which is illegal in chess. So they have to move their king away, which means you win the queen and thereby draw the game. This is a theoretical draw, whereas earlier, if you played your knight not to that square and did not give the fork, you would have actually lost the game. This is theoretically lost. So that fork actually saves you the game. So that's kind of an introduction to what a fork is when you're attacking multiple pieces at the same time with just one piece. Now, the knight is not the only piece that can give a fork. For example, the rook can also fork two pieces by attacking, for example, in this case, the king and the queen using its horizontal mobility. Now, here again, the queen cannot move because you're in check, but if the king moves, then you're going to have to lose the queen. So again, an uncomfortable decision for black. By force, they're going to have to move their king away, which thereby loses the queen. But black here in this case could just take the rook with the queen, but still it's a draw. Otherwise, it would have been it would have probably been a losing position for white. In addition to that, the bishop can also, they have forks of their own. In this case, it works along the diagonals, right? So in this case, white can actually take this pawn and attack along this diagonal, checking the king and the rook at the same time, which means that you're going to win the rook because the king has to move. So then you win the rook, attacking multiple pieces at the same time. Let's say if the king was like on a8, for example, you can take this pawn, attack the king, give it a check, but also attack the rook at the same time. So it can work along multiple different diagonals. But I just gave this example for the sake of simplicity. It's attacking two pieces at the same time along the same diagonal. Now, we've explored kind of the rooks, the knights, and bishops. Now, the culmination of forks is the queen, by far. The queen is the most powerful piece, the most long-ranging piece. It can scan the whole width and length and diagonals of the entire board, and thereby can make your opponent really uneasy because they're going to be more prone to forks. In this case, for example, black is down a queen for a rook, and let's say they move their rook to e7, immediately they get punished because now white can attack horizontally to give a check to the king, but at the same time attack diagonally to attack the rook, utilizing both the powers of the rook and the bishop at the same time. So you can see how loose black's position is, because no matter where they move their rook, they're probably going to get forked. In this case, for example, if the rook comes to h7, queen can give a check, and for example, just this is an example here, the queen can use both diagonals to attack the king and the rook like a bishop, and you'll win the rook now. It's very important, by the way, to be able to scan the entire board when you're looking at these kinds of moves, because like at first you may be thinking like, oh, what should I do? And you're kind of looking inside of this little box of squares here, and you're like thinking, oh, I can give a check like this and the king will move, and I can give a check like this. You start kind of getting tunnel vision, but in reality you've got to scan the entire board, and you can look beyond that little box and see that you're actually also forking the two pieces. So the queen is a very powerful piece, and it can fork in so many different ways. And what I wanted to highlight about this is an easy way, an easy rule to find forks in your own games is by looking at the color square that the pieces are on. And you might be thinking like, what does that even do? Well, what does that even mean? So there are two different kinds of squares, the light square and the dark squares in chess. You got half of each. But when you're giving checks and when you've got forks available, most of the time, unless you're talking about the queen, which is, a godly piece, if you have two pieces on the same colored square, let me go back to the knight example here. If you got two pieces, let's say on the same colored square, in this case the light squares, they're actually more prone to getting forked, because the knight can then attack both pieces on the same colored square at the same time. Another example is, well, not the rook in this case because they can attack like this, but mainly like the bishop, for example. The bishop has to attack, if it wants to fork, it has to attack two pieces on the same colored square. When they are on the same colored square, they're more prone to being forked. So it's not going to happen all the time. Obviously, it's not going to, but they're more prone to that situation, more likely to fall into a fork tactic. And the queen can utilize that pretty easily, like in this case, right? Same colored square. This one is a little bit trickier. If you give a check, the point is that actually if you move the king here, notice how they're on the same colored square, you can give a check and actually win the rook at the same time. Or if the king moves here, you got this check, and suddenly they're on the same colored square again. And you can give a check and win the rook like this. So that's just one tip to help you find forks quicker in your own games, and you don't actually have to calculate much. You just have to find some method to try kind of draw the king out towards the light squares so that you can get them on the same colored square, get the king and the rook on the same colored square, and then you can fork the king and the rook really easily. So I just wanted to showcase that. But in addition to that, you also can fork with pawns, and it's very interesting. Actually, in this case, white can actually fork the king and the rook, and it doesn't look like it's going to happen much in your games, but trust me, it happens quite often, and you can run into it a lot. Maybe not checking the king with your pawn, but attacking, let's say, a knight and a bishop, or like a rook and a bishop, or a rook and a knight. It happens a lot. The pawn can fork these two pieces, and the king has to move because they're in check, and then you can actually draw the game. This would have been completely lost if white did not have this move, right? If the king just moved, it's a completely losing game because black's just going to go and win the pawn. So these kinds of tactics, the fork tactic is really important to see. There's also a very rare case, but even the king can fork two pieces at the same time, and you can pause your video actually to try and figure out what the right move is here for white. Right now black is actually up a rook, so white's actually hoping to just draw. They can't really win this because they don't have enough pieces, but they can try to go from a losing position to a drawn position. So yeah, I'll give you a couple seconds to figure out what the move is here. Again, pause your video if you need more time. So here, a very interesting move for white, king g5. It's very bizarre because you're attacking two pieces with the king, which is supposed to be one of the weakest pieces in the entire game. Arguably, it is the weakest piece in the entire game. But the point is that the rook cannot stay defending the knight because it's on the edge of the board. If the rook moves back, you're going to win the knight, and this is a theoretical draw. King and bishop, as long as they stay close together, is going to draw against a king and a rook, no matter what. Well, almost no matter what. And you might be thinking, wait a second, but you can go here. And this is actually very clever because if you take the knight, then you can take the bishop, right, as black, and now you're winning because you're going to be up a full rook. That is a winning endgame. But here, white can take advantage of the fact that the king is way in the corner and give another fork, attacking the king and the rook at the same time along this diagonal. So although it doesn't seem like it at first, the more you study forks and fork tactics, you're going to see them a lot in your games. You're going to be starting to think like, oh, how can I get them into a position where I can fork their two pieces, right? You can start to see those tactics much more easily. So that was just an intro to forks, how all the different kinds of pieces can actually fork multiple pieces, but also a tip on like how to think about trying to find forks in your own games is usually looking for same colored square complexes. In this case, though, it's just because the king is such a weird piece, like it's attacking both of these pieces at the same time. This is an exception, very rare exception. Yeah, so that's forks for you. We're going to move on to pins here now. And pins are kind of hard to describe unless I show you an example. They can really only be used with bishops, rooks, queens. Those are the only pieces that can make pins. So pins are basically when you have a lower value piece in front of a higher value piece along the same line. And that's actually the trick to find pins. It's like, oh, are these on the same line? Yes, they are. I can try to move a piece to attack the lower value piece. And in this case, just to make things easier to understand, for example, this bishop can come here and utilize the fact that the rook and the king are on the same line. And the logic of the pin is that, can you move the rook? Well, no, because you lose the king. Well, can you move the king out so then the rook can move? Well, no, because you lose the rook. That's the idea of the pin, is that the lower value piece cannot move because there's a higher value piece hiding behind it. And by this process, it's very cool. You can actually immobilize a piece almost entirely because you cannot lose the piece behind it. Now, the bishop attacks along the diagonals, so when you see a rook and a king along the same diagonal, then you got to think about the pin, right? But when we're considering, let's say for black here, let me flip the board to make this easier. Let's think about the rook. So the rook travels vertically and horizontally. Now, how can you make a pin between the queen and the king, right? They're in the same line vertically. So here, you can actually bring the rook here and create a pin. Now, if you think about it, the queen cannot move away because, or else you're attacking the king, right? You cannot lose the king. So, and if the king moves, then you just win the queen. So queen versus rook is losing, but by this move, you can actually force the queen to stay on this file because on this file is very basically what we call vertical lines. Like in chess, vertical lines are files. On this file, the queen is stuck. Like the queen is immobilized. It cannot move away from the file, which means the rook is always going to be able to take the queen. It doesn't look like it's going to happen much in your games, but just to give you one example, this is in a semi-Slav. The opening is not going to be the focus of this video, but it's a very common opening. Basically here, black will actually take the pawn, and notice how white brought their bishop out to attack the knight, but also pinned the knight down to the queen. And now we've created a pin. The queen is stuck here, and you have to wait for the queen to move before you can move the knight. because or else you'd lose the queen behind it. So the knight is immobilized for now, and white now plays a sneaky move e4. The point is that black defends the pawn here with another pawn so that the bishop can't take it, but now white can play e5, and we utilize something called attacking the pinned piece. Point is that if you're pinning the knight down to the queen, this pawn is also attacking the knight simultaneously, so the knight can't move because you lose the queen, but if the queen moves, then you lose the knight. So that's how powerful a pin can be. It really just immobilizes the piece that's being pinned, and you can attack it, target it, bring pieces to attack it, and it just makes for a very logical way to win material, find ways to win material. So that's the basic of what a pin is. Just to give one example here, black plays knight c6, and here I'll give you a couple seconds to try and figure out what the move is here for white. You can pause your video if you want to. Now, this looks like a very ordinary move, knight c6, but it turns out it's actually a drastic blunder because white can actually just take. If you do take this, then it's going to, you just lost a knight, right? There's no reason to do that. But if you take that knight, then white has a pin. Notice how the queen and the king are on the same line. The bishop can come out and give a pin, make a pin. And now the problem is that if the queen moves away, then you're attacking the king. So the queen cannot move. And if the king moves, then you lose the queen, right? Well, the king can't move. So you'd have to like block the pin first before your queen can move, but it's too late. You're going to lose the queen. So hopefully this video gives you some idea on how to utilize pins and forks in your own games and how to find them. In this case, just to recap, forks are when you're attacking multiple pieces at the same time with one piece, and usually you want to look for pieces on the same colored square so that you can attack both of them at the same time with knights, bishops, but you can also attack them with queens and rooks. Queens are very good for forking two pieces. And also pins. Pins are when you're attacking a lower value piece, but behind that lower value piece is a higher value piece. And the point is that you're immobilizing the lower value piece because the higher value piece does not want to be taken. So it's tied down, pinned down by, in this case, it's a bishop. So yeah, hope you enjoyed this video, and let us know what you think in the comments. Like and subscribe if you like our content. And yeah, we're going to continue this series in the next video on more tactical themes. So see you guys in the next video.